Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and a lot of chaos continues to rage surrounding immigration in Minnesota. A lot of big events have happened there. One of those big events was what is being called a church invasion, protesters storming into a worship service at City's Church in St. Paul. And so we're going to be talking about that today, and I'm joined by John Brown from the Christian Post. How you doing, John?
I'm good, Billy. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to chat with you. You've written a number of stories on all of this chaos. This has really been the biggest story, I think, in Christian news over the past week. Let's start with what triggered it. What triggered the protest at City's Church that we saw unfold?
So obviously, you're right. This is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, national story this week because I think it really distillates the political and spiritual divides in this country right now. It shows how these two sides are able to look at the same thing and reach totally different conclusions. So a
Yeah.
group of left-wing protesters, they stormed and interrupted the morning service at City's Church while the pastor, Jonathan Parnell, he's actually a relatively young pastor. He was preaching, ironically, about the importance of loving one another. He talked about the church being a light to the Twin Cities amid all the chaos there. And it's not an overtly political church. It's not political at all, really. They just preach the gospel. It's a Southern Baptist church. But politics have come to them now because these protesters, some of them with ties to Black Lives Matter in the area, they were angry that one of the pastors, who I won't name, but he also serves as the acting director of the ICE field office there in St. Paul. So they were basically imputing onto him and all the other churchgoers, for that matter, their outrage about the ICE crackdowns in that city. And so obviously the fatal shooting of Renee Good recently, that's prompted a lot of anger. But these protesters took it upon themselves to get in the face of these Christians in a way that many found really outrageous and unfair, including the DOJ, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, this is something you don't see every day, is people storming into a church service to stop it in protest. And let's just talk about the reaction, because obviously we've seen a lot of news reaction. How did the congregation, church leadership, including Pastor Jonathan Parnell, how did they respond to that disruption in real time? For those who have not seen the videos or read the stories.
Well, they were incredibly gracious, more so than I think I would have been, and some even agreed to dialogue with Don Lemon, the former CNN guy who was there, putting his microphone in people's faces. And he actually even grilled the pastor at his pulpit about the Constitution and Jesus. And you could tell the pastor was just trying to get a hold of the situation, and he asked them very calmly to leave the building. And when I saw footage of this, it went viral. I was at first kind of annoyed that the guys in these church were so gentle. And a lot of people criticized the men, especially, for not being more forceful and tossing them out of the building. But I think that would have just inflamed the situation and given the protesters more fuel. So I think they probably handled it perfectly.
Yeah, it's well, we'll talk a little bit more about Don Lemon, but there's a lot happening there, and it's also hard in real time. People will judge reactions in real time, but I think to your point, the reactions seemed. I even saw people praying. I saw one woman with her hand raised, praying in the direction of the protesters. It seemed, at least, that's what was going on when you watch the footage. But let's talk about the legal and civil rights issues. What legal and civil rights issues have arisen from this protest, and what laws are being considered in the investigation? Because the U.S. government obviously is investigating what unfolded.
So we're recording this Friday morning. As of now, three of the protesters have already been arrested. There might be more arrests, and they're being arrested for federal violations of religious freedom, civil rights. Ironically, the FACE Act, which was used by the Biden administration to arrest Christians protesting at abortion clinics, uh, the law also prohibits disrupting religious services. So that's one of the things they're being charged under. And then also, there's a portion of the U.S. Code that's related to the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is basically conspiracy against uh, civil rights. And so they might also face some state law issues, trespassing, disorderly conduct. And the church itself is lawyered up, and it might seek some civil claims as well.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out. Obviously, the Justice Department, federal authorities reacting to this in the ways that were just mentioned, and you mentioned the arrest there. We'll see where else that goes. Also, though, there was a fundraiser on Give Send Go. There is one, rather, for City's Church. Talk a little bit about that. Where does that stand, and what does that suggest about the public reaction, how the public is seeing what unfolded?
Yeah, so a couple days ago, Benny Johnson, he's a popular conservative podcaster. He set up this Give Send Go with the permission of the pastor, and they raised tens of thousands in hours. And it's been up for a couple days. Last I checked, they've raised 50,000. Their goal is 100,000, and I assume they'll use that money for beefing up security, legal fees. But I think it shows the church has a lot of sympathy with a lot of the public, and I think it's pushing, I hope, the average person to really wake up to see just how Christianity is increasingly under attack in this country.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you are in a church service, and let's just talk about this for a moment here. You've had numerous instances of churches being attacked violently with gunmen. And
Right.
you had a woman in Nashville that attacked a Christian school. And you look at all of this and you then assume, how would you feel if you're in worship and people storm in, you don't know who they are, you don't know what the intent is, the amount of fear and terror that people would be struck with, and likely were struck with, as we see in those videos at City's Church. It's understandable why people would be fearful and why this is such a big deal. Now, let's talk about Don Lemon, because this former CNN journalist, obviously, CNN host, how has he characterized this church storming, and why have some of his comparisons sparked controversy? Because he's been out there kind of doubling down since this unfolded.
Yeah, he feels totally justified. He claims he's sort of distanced himself from it since the federal investigation, claiming he was just a journalist they're chronicling. But there's footage of him getting coffee and donuts with the protesters beforehand. He gave the head organizer a kiss. Um, And so he's characterized it, he's compared it to Jesus flipping the tables in the temple. So he's likening himself and what they did in a way to Jesus, which has offended a lot of people. But it's a talking point that I keep seeing from a lot of people, liberal Christians like Shane Claiborne just used it the other day. But I think the analogy totally falls apart because Jesus kicking the money changers out of the temple was, I believe, a unique act that only he had the authority to do since it was his temple. And he actually wasn't cleansing the temple itself, he was cleansing the outer court of the Gentiles, which was also symbolic of the Gentiles later being grafted into the covenant by the gospel. So, what Jesus was doing was, I think, a bit deeper than what Don Lemon and his company were doing, I would say.
Well, yeah, I mean, and this is why understanding theology is so important. What's actually going on, not what you want to, imbue or force upon the text itself. And yeah, so thank you for explaining that. And what an interesting comparison. And what's so oddly intriguing about all of this is that you have people exercising their First Amendment right as churchgoers, and other people storming into a private church and saying, no, 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 we're exercising our right to interrupt your church service. And, it's so inverted in so many ways, how this is even being discussed by some people like Lemon and others. How have other public figures, commentators, and those with, big platforms, how are they framing this incident?
Well, it's interesting. This was just a coincidence, but I happened to interview Alveda King, the niece of Martin Luther King Jr., on Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, which was the day after this happened. And I asked her opinion of all of that because Don Lemon actually invoked the civil rights movement. He likened the protests to stuff that would have happened back then with, her uncle. And she said, Don Lemon may not remember that my uncle encouraged nonviolence. And we were taught to be nonviolent and to protest peacefully. So I thought what she had to say was very astute. But
Yeah.
also, other leaders have weighed in as well. President Trump has repeatedly talked about it. He's called them agitators and insurrectionists. He called Don Lemon a loser uh, earlier. And so he's definitely on board with prosecuting these people. I
Yeah.
will note Russell Moore hasn't said anything, but Al Mohler, he made a rare Sunday tweet to denounce it. And he wrote a really great column for World earlier this week. He characterized it as like the seismic dark turn that Christians in the U.S. really haven't seen before. He said some on the left now see it as totally okay to intimidate Christians who don't align with their agenda. And he warned this sort of mentality is probably going to spread.
Yeah, well, and that's what's concerning. After watching Charlie Kirk's assassination, after seeing what happened with President Trump twice, after watching what happened to, the United Healthcare CEO, that these political assassinations or acts of violence, and I'm not comparing what happened at the church to that. What I'm saying is people's willingness to bend rules or do the unthinkable, or their willingness to just, at a bare minimum, inconvenience others, interrupt church services, do these sorts of things. I think the fear a lot of people have is this going to get worse? Are there going to be more, actions like this? And so, I guess I would just close by asking you, what are the broader implications of this event when it comes to the relationship between protest movements, churches, and the law here in America?
Well, I think this is just another stark example of the clashing worldviews that we have in this country, which I think are really two competing religions at this point. It's
Mm.
interesting. The FACE Act, as I said, protects both abortion clinics and churches from being disrupted by protests, which I think tells you something. Because in a lot of ways, abortion is the sacrament of the left in this country, and abortion clinics are the churches of that. And as I said, Christians have been prosecuted, rightly or wrongly, under the clear text of that law for standing in the way of that. So now you have the same thing happening on the other side. Both sides think they're justified because this is ultimately, I think, a religious spiritual battle. So I think the real takeaway is that these two religions or worldviews or whatever you want to call them, they've really reached an impasse. And I think we're going to see more clashes like this in the future, sadly.
Well, you'll continue to cover that, and we'll continue to have you on to discuss it. John, appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post, christianpost.com, for all the news you need to read. And we'll be back next week with another episode of The Inside Story.